together scientists and researchers from more than 7 disciplines, as well as practicing businessmen, economists, journalists, and specialized experts from different fields. Understanding the fundamentals of the economy can provide answers about the knowledge and skills necessary not only for surviving in the market in unpredictable conditions, but for achieving the well-being of many, a process which is not spontaneous but mastered. I am sincerely honored and pleased to welcome everyone to the online panel number 4 of the international conference arranged by the European Academy of Sciences of Ukraine. And today we are glad to welcome the reunion of experts in the framework of Real Life and Real Economics conference discussion. So the key discussion points of the current online session are: the first one, examples of contradictions in the history of business and technological history. And the second one, what is the formula of a business? Which sciences compose that? I am Iryna Lopatiuk, and I'm happy to be your moderator today. And now please let me introduce our speakers right in the way they're given the floor. Dr. Geoffrey Brian West, theoretical physicist, former president and distinguished professor of the Santa Fe Institute, Presidium member and academician of European Academy of Sciences of Ukraine. He is the author of several books, among which is Scale, the Universal Laws of Growth, Innovation, Sustainability, and the Pace of Life in Organisms, Cities, Economies, and Companies. He is the visiting professor of mathematics at Imperial College, London, and an associate fellow of the Said Business School at Oxford University. West has since been honored as one of Time magazine's 100. He is a member of the World Knowledge Dialogue Scientific Board. Welcome, dear professor. Our next speaker is Andrew Wagner, an investment management and investment consultant. He is the author of The Economics of Online Gaming, a player's introduction to economic thinking, an economics textbook that shows how a video game can make economics more interesting, more exciting, and easier to understand. His professional experience covers consulting projects in a wide range of investment strategies, asset classes, and industries, and his ghostwritten research has appeared in national and regional publications. He has a master's degree in economics from Kansas State University. Welcome, Andrew Wagner. Our next expert and speaker, Dr. Lucian Ulab, writer, lecturer, sociologist, political scientist, academician of European Academy of Sciences of Ukraine. He is a chief editor of scientific journal Dogma. Dr. Lucien spent many years working together with the French thinker Jean Baudrillard, author of numerous scientific papers and books on French nihilism and neo-Leninism, radical Islamism, anti-Americanism, and anti-Semitism. Our next speaker is Svetlana Illiusha, Masters in Financial Management, Research Fellow of the Scientific Research Institute, International Fate Analysis Society, Editor-in-Chief of the scientific newspaper Your Fate, member of Philosophical and Psychological Scientific Society. Let me now please deliver just a few words concerning the reference terms of this panel. So each speaker has the opportunity to answer 2 questions in 2 rounds, and please limit the extent of your speeches up to 10 minutes. To begin with, we shall start the discussion with the very first issue. And I suggest it's the high time we started the discussion. So the question number 1 is as follows: examples of contradictions in the history of business and technological history. And right away, let me please give the floor to our first speaker, Professor Geoffrey Brian West. You're welcome. Please turn on your mic.
Muting. Hi, thank you. Thank you, Iryna, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me. Delighted to be participating, though I must say this is certainly the history in business and technology is not my expertise. And in fact, I had a little bit of trouble interpreting just what the context of this question was. So I'm going to give, obviously from my own view and some of the work that I've been involved in, and I didn't prepare a linear talk, but more a bunch of notes and a bunch of thoughts. And in terms of the history, of course, business goes back to essentially to the beginnings of civilization, so to speak. Obviously, we needed business in order for communities to work, whether they're small ones, and eventually the growth of cities and so on required businesses, transactions, economies to develop, and so on. But the modern sense of what a company is, what business is, sort of had its real origins in the Industrial Revolution. I mean, the discovery and consequent exploitation of fossil fuels and this extraordinary unleashing of energy, coupled with the development of capitalism and entrepreneurship at the beginning of the 19th century, obviously opened up a whole new era and a whole new way of doing business and what business meant, and the forming of the modern sense, the beginnings of the modern sense of what companies and corporations are. And that was, as I say, stimulated by the Industrial Revolution, and therefore develops hand in glove, so to speak, with technology. But of course, they have very different motivations. And one of the things that developed out of capitalism and entrepreneurship was the profit motive being a major component of what was driving the formation of companies. On the other hand, technology was driven by having to solve explicit problems. Not that companies weren't trying to solve problems, but that they needed to make a profit, whereas technology, in terms of science and the development of science following the Enlightenment, had a different motivation. And in that sense, there were contradictions, and there were contradictions throughout the 19th century, and tension, of course, between these two. And I would say that and I'm not, as I said, I'm not a historian, it's not my expertise, these different motivations, one to make profits, one to get knowledge, to solve problems in order to increase the quality and standard of living, which is not the motivation for companies, but is the motivation to some extent of technology and by implication of governments. Tension was, of course, recognized very explicitly by Marx. And I guess Marx's solution was that in order to decrease this tension and in order to ameliorate the quality and standard of living for all, much better to put the business of finance and companies and production and indeed science and technology in the hands of government. And that's the way I see the coming of Marxism and communism. And it was to my mind, a very simplistic solution, which sadly, in a way, proved to be a failure. But of course, that brings up the question of what is success? How do we define success? And and of course, that's a question I'm not going to attempt to answer, because success has to do with qualities like happiness, indices of happiness, indices of fulfillment, and so on. And I think we could make that part of the discussion. But more so, I think, is that from a purely economic viewpoint, in terms of what has been defined in terms of materialistic improvements, Marxism proved not to be as successful as rampant capitalism. But rampant capitalism, of course, had its own problems. And one of the major ones, of course, we're dealing with now is, in fact, its effect on the environment, the effect on the pace of life, and the general feeling of unease about the future, because built into capitalism and built into the positive feedback mechanisms that are integral to the profit motive, and at the same time the economies of scale associated with it, has led to open-ended exponential growth. And we have there what was already seen at the beginning of the Industrial Revolutions by Malthus, and who was much influenced Marx, was the problem of whether that is even conceivably sustainable. And that tension, I think, is coming from this tension between business and technology. Now, coming up to the present, we have, we're seeing it now very as part of the very sustainability of the planet, because we have the big issue now of what the destructive forces of fossil fuel economies, which dominate the planet, that is the burning up of the planet, literally. That's what we've been doing for 200 years, literally burning the surface of the planet. It's very clear that that cannot continue. And now we have to make this transition to renewable sources, solar energy, wind, and so forth. And there we begin again, this contradiction, if you like, this tension between, on the one hand, the profit motive of companies. It is not necessarily in the interest of most companies and corporations to switch from traditional fossil fuel, oil and gas, coal, to renewable energy. And yet it is very much in the long-term interests and the well-being of the 7.5, soon to be 10 billion people on the planet to develop that. So this tension is now really coming to a head. And I think what we're going to be seeing into the middle of this century is, in fact, if you like, a battle, which I hope will be benign and not active battle, not a hot battle, but a kind of cool battle between the forces of conservatism, which are part of business, that is the continuation of what we have, dominated by profit motive, versus the development of technology, which primarily has been fostered by governments, with some businesses getting very slowly involved. And of course, that comes back to this Marxist view, because the place that has probably done most with this is a communist country, namely China, because they can do this, they can take this Marxist paradigm and do it top down. And so I would hate to think that that's the way we're going to solve the problem. I hate to think that the forces that are presently at work on the planet in terms of the move towards more and more authoritarian rule in order to solve these problems is the way we're going to solve them. I would much prefer to see much more, at least the inspiration and the promise of freedom of expression and the forces of the free market play a major role in this. So that's a big open question, and the future of the planet actually depends to a large degree on understanding this, what was called in this question, the contradictions on the one hand between business and between technology. Now, I think I will finish there. I'm just looking at my notes to see if there's anything else I want to add to that. But generically speaking, I think that, as I say, this has been a continuous problem, but one which has in fact been beneficial to a large degree, frankly, but has also produced these terrible consequences. And now those terrible consequences are becoming more and more dominant, and we need to face those and solve these problems. And one of the new developments that is moving a little bit in that direction is within business, is instead of it being totally dominated by the profit motive, which is sort of one's image of the 19th century and into the 20th century, is the beginnings of social responsibility and the role of corporations and businesses, at least superficially, beginning to take on some of the burden of doing things not just for profit, but for the quality and standards of living of the people. So I'll finish there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor, for delivering your speech. And right away, please let me give the floor to the next speaker, Andrew Wagner. You're welcome, sir. Please turn on your mic.
Thank you. I'm very excited to be part of this conference. So my research is primarily in modern history, so that's where my examples are coming from to answer this question. And I really see the history of technology and the history of business as two related subjects with separate tracks. So a historian that focuses on one will sometimes miss the value of the other. And looking at it this way, I see two similar types of historical contradictions that show up in modern history. The first contradiction is the difference between a new technology and a new business market. So important technological achievements are not always recognized as a business success, and business growth doesn't always come from a new technology. And a business focus won't really care about the technology unless it has an obvious, significant market value. And the second type of contradiction that I see is similar to the first, and it's about who gets the credit for a new innovation. So is it the inventor who figured out how to do it? Or is it the business that built the device? Or is it the customer that said, this is what we want? So with my examples, I'm going to start with the first contradiction. And in most historical cases, a new technology will come many years before the business market is ready for it. And modern history has a lot of examples of this. The time period known as the Golden Age of American radio began a few decades after the first radio was invented. The time period known as the Golden Age of American television came a few decades after the first television was invented. And the first demonstration of a truly modern computer, complete with a mouse, online collaboration, was actually presented in an event called the Mother of All Demos all the way back in 1968. It took about 20 to 30 years before the internet and the personal computer revolution made this technology into a market for the average person. So it takes time for technology to become useful and affordable as a business consumer market. And the contradiction is that maybe these time periods that are called a golden age should be also talking about the technology growth from when the new device was invented to when it became a market, and not just the period of when the market became really big. And this is also true for more recent history. So when you think about the history of smartphones, the introduction of the iPhone kind of marks the beginning of the rise of the smartphone business. But the iPhone was not the first smartphone. The first smartphone, or the first phone that would fit the definition of a smartphone, was actually made by IBM about 15 years before the IBM, or before the iPhone. And no one is really talking about the technological achievement of IBM's smartphone because the consumer market was not ready for it yet. So I see this as a contradiction in the history of the business and the history of the technology. The first one to come out is not always the most successful, but business highlights what is the most successful. And for the second type of historical contradiction that comes from who gets the credit, it's the way that a technological achievement is framed is what determines who is recognized as the source of a big idea. So for example, if we go back to the development of the big mainframe computers, IBM gets the glory, gets the attention for developing these things. But a significant part of the funding for these computers actually came from the federal government. And the largest source for the demand of the computational power also came from the federal government. So this is where we find the contradiction between the technological history and the business history. If there was not such a big customer demanding these products and providing the funding to make it happen, then would the technology still be developed? I think the answer in some cases is no, but the IBM computers still have the IBM names on them. And to put it the other way, it's not always the business that gets credit. The development of the network called ARPANET, which was the precursor to the internet, has a similar contradiction. The name itself includes the government agency that demanded it, the Advanced Research Projects Agency, or ARPA. So ARPA was the organization that came up with the big ideas for ARPANET and coordinated with all the companies that made it possible. So it certainly deserves its part of the credit for developing the system. But we also overlook the businesses that built the machines that made it possible and the engineers who designed them. So ARPANET was a government technology program made possible by private business. A historian that looks at technology and a historian that looks at business might see these different ways, and I see that as a contradiction. And then there are also some examples where both of these contradictions exist at the same time. And this happens when you're looking at the basic research that makes an industry possible. So for example, it's considered a major business and technological achievement when a private company sends a rocket ship up into space. But these companies are standing on the shoulders of the government agencies like NASA that did all of the research and took all of the risk that made this market possible. So they all deserve credit for the part that they played, but if you only look at it from the business side, you would miss out on NASA's contributions. So to summarize, that's where I see these contradictions coming from. They happen when there is a gap in time from a new technology to a new business market. And then they happen when there is a conflict in who gets credit for a technological achievement. And I think these contradictions will always exist, but a good historian will try to focus on both at the same time. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for delivering your speech. Thank you, Andrew Wagner. And right now, I guess it's high time. We've given the floor to our professor from France, Lucian Ulab. Let me kindly remind you, we're discussing examples of contradictions in the history of business and technological history. So please, you're welcome.
Thank you. I am sorry to be late because I believe it's 1 o'clock later. And thank you to having me. I know Lucien very much, but about the topic, I can say the difficulties in France, for instance, to have a project organized between both public and private business. It's very difficult sometimes to understand each other, and also, for instance, 30 years ago, you have a supersonic plane. His name is Concorde. Concorde is a very beautiful plane, very fast, but maybe a little bit with a problem of pollution, if you want, but not too much like the big Boeing, if you want. But it was a state project with Britain state also, and it's opportunity to reduce the travel by half of time, and it was a possibility to open the country, if you want, because it was experimental also. But the state, the United States, decided to forbidden the possibility to the Concorde to continue to go to New York, because the USA have also a private supersonic projects, but it is not at this time. It is not operational, and is why they had the capacity to stop this project. This is not just a project, it's a finality. It's a very beautiful object, by the way. And they decided to forbidden the capacity to travel with this plane. And the British government accepted, but also the French government. But it was a pity for me because it was most political than just technical or environmental problem. It was a contradiction between the public possibility to travel faster and the willingness to stop all the concurrency, and I saw it was a very big problem. But you have also now this kind of problem also. For instance, in France, you have a big technology with nuclear electricity, and but some people hate this kind of power and decided to close bit by bit to close the nuclear central, the civil nuclear central, by the half during the next decade, and to replace this by some aleatoire energy like aeolian or solars, or this kind of energy are not very stable, very strong, and when you are no wind and you are no solar, it's very difficult to perdure, to organize the continuity of the network electricity. It's why it's necessary to have a gas central beside. And I heard today that a lot of businessmen who organize the central gas have the capacity to finance, to invest inside the aeolian and solar system. But it's very contradictory, because this kind of industry in first place are not stable, I already said, but also we have a cost in environmental way. For instance, it's necessary to have a lot of elements which be provided by the shiny, by the other people, very rare stuff, very precious. And also you have this kind of block of I don't remember the name in English, béton, the block of stone, which is necessary to stand up the aeolian, if you want. And you have a lot of people who reject that now because it's unstable, and also it's very ugly to see in the country, this kind of of material, and you have also the the impossibility for some animals to fly in between them. Well, and so on.
Oulahbib, I'm so sorry to interrupt you. Could you please just in 30 seconds conclude your speech?
Yes. As I can say, in each time, 20 years ago with 30 years ago with the Concorde, and now with the aerial industry and so on, we have always conflict between the public and the private, but is not in the good way. For instance, to organize the better system for all the people. It's often and always we have a very discrepancy between a good idea and the very bad politics with very interest conflict, and it's very bad if you want a universal politic, for instance, to protect the environment, to protect the durability of product. It's why.
Thank you, Professor Lucian Ulab. Thank you so much. Thank you for sharing your viewpoints. And right away, let me please give the floor to our next speaker, as far as our reference terms are concerned. So, Svetlana, Illiusha, you're welcome. Turn on your mic, please.
Здравствуйте. Спасибо большое за возможность участвовать в этой конференции. Для меня это большая честь.
My best regards and pleased to greet everyone. Thank you so much again for having me, for giving me an opportunity to take participation in this conference. I'm really honored.
В контексте первого вопроса мы могли бы сказать, что классическая история часто представляет нам историю возникновения каких-то сложных систем как некий стихийный, естественный процесс эволюции или развития.
In the context of the first question discussed, I believe that classic history usually depicts and settles out special complicated mechanisms like economical mechanisms and the others in the way they emerge spontaneously, just like out of nowhere, or just in a certain specific natural way.
Например, что касается истории биржи. Считается, что биржа возникла сама по себе, исходя из того, что развивалась торговля.
For example, I would love to speak about the stock exchange history. I mean, the story of the way the stock exchange appeared as a phenomenon. So it is believed in the classical history viewpoint that the stock exchange has been spontaneously emerged due to the processes of trading progress.
То есть сначала торговцы собирались на площади в городе для того, чтобы совершать сделки, а потом они перешли в некое здание, повесили табличку для того, чтобы якобы так удобнее было вести дела.
The history says that actually certain merchants, certain people who were involved in trading, they first of all gathered together on the, let me say, like a city market square, and they closed their contracts or closed their deals over there. Then, being a little bit, let me say, tired of gathering somewhere in the square, in the open air, they have decided to go somewhere in the building. They made like a name, this is the place for trading, and they continued to deal in trading marks over there, inside the house.
В 2015 году украинским ученым Олегом Викторовичем Мальцевым были представлены результаты масштабного исследования, посвященного истории возникновения биржи как явления и как системы.
In 2015, by the prominent scholar in research Oleg Maltsev, certain results of the scientific research of the phenomenon of stock exchange were presented, and we should say that these results highlighted the stock exchange as the unique complete system.
И в результате этого исследования было установлено, что биржа не возникла сама по себе. Это коммуникационная система, которая специально сконструирована и воплощена в жизнь.
According to the results of Dr. Maltsev's research, it was verified and it was achieved as a scientific discovery that actually the stock exchange as a phenomena did not spontaneously emerge, since it was engineered and implemented as a communication system.
И была найдена технология создания биржи. Она состоит из двух этапов.
Moreover, the technology of the stock exchange construction was also revealed, and as far as this technology is concerned, it consists of two stages or two steps.
Первый этап – это создание некого главного офиса с целью организации рынка. Это создает группа лиц, которая впоследствии будет, по сути, владельцами будущей биржи.
So the very first stage means that we are dealing with the exchange owners. I mean, these are the people, like the group of people who are settled together to organize the future market. In the very, let me say, just in several decades, these people would be the exchange owners. This is like the main brain center who is constructing the stock mechanism itself.
Вторая биржа – это непосредственно площадка, где будут происходить торги.
As far as the second type of stock is concerned, we should, by this notion, realize a certain platform. It's like the environmental platform where people meet and trade.
После этого первая биржа, то есть первый главный офис, уходит в тень. И мы видим сегодня существующие биржи, которые на первый взгляд является единственной запчастью в этой системе.
Times passes by, and the first very office of the exchange stock gets invisible. I mean that actually it like sneaks in the shadow. We don't see those brain organizers who have engineered the stock exchange at all. However, we see the rest of the offices, the rest of the usual exchange stocks, people are trading even these days.
В ходе исследования и научных экспедиций в Европе были найдены примеры применения вот этой двухтактовой технологии создания биржи.
And within the scientific expeditionary research by the expeditionary corps and scientific groups, the examples, the verification points, and certain, let me say, arguments were, as far as this two-stage technology is concerned, were found and revealed.
Эта технология была применена при создании биржи в городе Брюгге, нынешняя Бельгия, в XV веке.
Moreover, we should add that the same technology we're discussing right now was also implemented for engineering and making the stock exchange in Brugge work even in the 15th century.
Второй раз эта же технология была применена в Одессе при создании биржи в XIX веке.
The second time, we definitely know this technology was implemented, it was used and applied to create the exchange stock in Odessa in 19th century.
Такая система, как биржа, безусловно, имеет свои специфические функции.
As a matter of fact, such a specific mechanism and phenomena as stock exchange has its own specific characteristics and functions.
Первое – это создание и управление рынком.
So the very first function and characteristic is connected with the creation of the market. I mean, we have to set the market, we have to create this environmental sphere and then manage this. And by management and creation, we mean both the micro level and the other levels.
Второе – это коммуникационная система, как было сказано, которая позволяет владельцам, создателям этой биржи, находящимся за ширмой, получать абсолютно полную и достоверную информацию о ситуации на рынке в режиме реального времени.
Secondly, by the function, we should mean that we are dealing with a communication system. It's not just like the stock exchange. This is the communication system that allows the stockholders and owners, I mean, those who are back in the shadows, we don't see them, they're invisible. This communication system allows one to receive comprehensive and reliable or accurate information concerning the market and participants of the market in the real time.
Ну и, безусловно, это машина по зарабатыванию денег и, более того, машина по ограблению биржи или ограблению рынка.
And no doubt, we should say that some peculiar functions of stock exchange are as follows. First of all, one can make money on stock exchange. And secondly, one may even rob the markets by this mechanism application.
Что имеется в виду? Пока другие игроки пытаются заработать на разнице котировок, пытаются заработать на бирже, те, кто владеют этой коммуникационной системой, выигрывают всегда. Они, независимо от котировок, зарабатывают деньги всегда.
So what actually do we mean by this robbery point? I mean that actually, on the one hand, we have people, just usual participants in the stock exchange environment. They are closing their deals and they're trying to play the prognosis game in order to make their money. However, on the second hand, we are dealing with the stockholders who definitely don't have the task. They are not geared with the task of making prognosis. They already have the whole information. That's why they just close the best contracts and make the most of the money, since they owe all the mechanisms and all the information, all the data connected with it.
Тем не менее, были найдены две технологии, по сути, ограбления биржи. Одна персональная, посредством которой реализовывается посредством одного человека, и вторая групповая, когда необходима группа лиц, некий капитан и команда.
Moreover, within their scientific research, we also managed to find the two other technologies that allow, let me say, to rob the market, I mean, to grab the most of the money. And by two technologies, we mean two different approaches lying in the basis of these technologies. The first approach is the personal one. I mean, when one person enters the stock exchange and grabs a lot of money. And the second one provides the approach of the group of people, when the group of people are organized in order to achieve this result.
Я приведу пример исторический, когда один человек смог ограбить биржу.
And I would love to share with you one historical example or instance showing the way the one person managed to rob the stock exchange.
В июне 1815 года, когда началась битва при Ватерлоу,
We are speaking about the Waterloo fight. This is the June 1815.
Натан Ротшильд пришел на лондонскую биржу и спровоцировал падение цен.
Nathan Rothschild entered the London Stock Exchange and provoked the decay of the costs on the stock exchange.
Он начал продавать облигации государственного займа Англии, и все начали повторять за ним.
He started selling the Great Britain national obligations, and the rest of the people who watched him, they were surprised. However, they started copying his actions.
И когда цена упала буквально до нескольких центов, он скупил их все.
And right at that very moment, when the total price was actually like several pence, I mean, it decreased like in the most dramatic way, then Nathan Rothschild managed to buy all the obligations from the stock exchange.
И на следующее утро Натан Ротшильд проснулся фактически владельцем Англии.
So actually he sold everything, he provoked the others to sell everything, then on the lowest price he purchased all the obligations back, and then the very next morning he woke up as one of the richest people in the world.
Как вы помните, семейство Ротшильдов создали собственную коммуникационную систему, а именно почту.
Moreover, the Rothschilds family are those people who actually invented one of the most, let me say, widespread communication system. By this, we mean the post.
Также доктором Мальцевым в результате этого исследования было установлено, что биржа является лишь 1/5 составляющей технологии более высокого порядка.
Then Dr. Maltsev managed to verify that actually speaking about the stock exchange communication system mechanism, we're dealing only with 1/5 of the thorough technology. I mean, the stock exchange is only one element, there are 4 more.
Эта вышестоящая технология была создана для установления власти бескровным способом на определенной территории, и биржа является 1/5 этой технологии.
By this technology consisting of 5 elements, we mean the technology that sets as its major objective to achieve the power worldwide without shedding the rivers of blood. I mean, this is just the technology that helps one to gain the power throughout the world.
И в завершение я хотела бы привести цитату экономиста и эксперта по фондовым биржам Андреа Костолани. Биржевые курсы зависят от того, кого на данный момент больше, акций или идиотов. Спасибо за внимание.
And in order to finish my report, I would like to quote the economist and stock market expert Andrea Castellani. So the quotation is as follows: the whole stock market depends only on whether there are more shares than idiots or more idiots than shares. Thank you so much for your kind attention. So this was the first question. We have discussed the examples of contradictions in history of business. And right now it's high time we started a discussion upon the second question. So what is the formula of a business, or which sciences compose it? And I'm honored to give the floor to our speaker, Professor Geoffrey Brian West. You're welcome.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Iryna. I'll hold it 1 second. I gotta get this properly set up. Yeah, okay. Sorry, okay. Yeah, so I feel much more on familiar ground, may I say, addressing this question than the previous one. As I say, I'm not a historian of technology or a historian of business, but I have worked quite a bit on trying to understand companies and social organizations in general, but as a physicist from a scientific viewpoint. And part of the work that I do is asking the question, is it conceivable to have a science or even a physics of companies and cities, and therefore of economies, in the sense that there are laws and principles, and to what extent can they be made predictive? And that's a huge question. But that's as a complement to the more traditional way of talking about this issue, which is much more to do with narrative and case studies. And the fact that you've used the word formula and science in this question implies that there's maybe it's a question of itself. Is there some generality? Is there something that transcends the individuality of a company? That every company and every business thinks of itself as unique in the same way, by the way, that each one of us thinks of ourselves as unique. And one aspect of the literature, of the narrative literature on business, which there are, thousands and thousands of books written by people in business schools, ex-CEOs of companies, etc., all of which tend to be rather narrowly focused. One of them, they often use scientific or certainly biological metaphors. The economy, the ecology of the marketplace, the DNA of a company, the metabolism of a city, using these phrases metaphorically, presumably. And the question is, to what extent, if you use the word science in it and formula, to what extent can these be made more precise and not just be sort of, as I say, metaphorical phrases? So one aspect that is true about business and companies, and I'm going to focus on companies, but it's also true of cities, is that they are what we call complex adaptive systems. They're like organisms in that sense, that they're highly complex. They're made of a huge number of components, of course, and they're interacting in a highly nonlinear way. They have emergent behavior. That is, for example, a city is not the sum of all the people. It's not the sum of all the buildings. It's not the sum of all the electrical lines. It's much more than all those things put together. Of course, the platitude that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, and that's an integral part of developing a science of this. But one of the extraordinary things about organisms, let me talk about that first, is that despite the fact that they all look different, they all have unique histories. We all believe in the theory of natural selection, the theory of evolution by natural selection, that not only each organism, but each component, each organ, each cell type, each genome has its own unique history, in which case you think of it all as just a big random mess. And in fact, I'm looking out of my window now across the valley, and it does look like totally arbitrary and capricious. But the extraordinary thing is that it satisfies actually surprisingly precise rules. And this is not the time to go into those, but it does satisfy those rules. And those rules are a result of natural selection, but they can be encapsulated in the idea that they're underlying all this are two major network systems. One is that to do with the physicality of the system. And if you think of business, there is a physical nature to it. There's goods and produce, and there's buildings to work in and so on. That's part of business. So there's the physicality of the system. So biology, it's my body. But there's also another piece, which is information, the flow of information. And of course, in business, that's crucial. Social networks. And inside each one of you, as I look at my screen, there are all kinds of signals going on, all kinds, both within your body and certainly in your brain. And these two systems coexist, and they have to be completely integrated. That's true whether you're an organism, a city, or a business. And that not only are they integrated, there's a tension between them. They have quite different behaviors, and they operate with different currencies. And but nevertheless, it turns out one can develop a science based on that, and it's based on networks. Networks play a crucial role, and it is the mathematics and physics of those networks and the processes and the feedback mechanisms inherent in natural selection that gives rise to these laws, because roughly speaking, the feedback mechanisms in natural selection drive the system as a whole, on the average, towards some kind of optimization. It's amazing to think that inside your body are all these networks, and your circulatory system has evolved so that if you make any change to it, your heart has to work harder. So you have evolved that way, not just you, but every single mammal that has ever existed. And so it is with cities, and so it is to a lesser extent for business and companies. I say to a lesser extent because businesses and companies only exist for a very short time. Businesses are usually only around for 5 to 10 years. Most businesses die extremely quickly. There's a few businesses that might last 50 years, and there are very, very few that might last 100 or 200 years. And one of the big questions in terms of the science is, why is that? Whereas another social organization, a city, lasts for potentially for thousands of years. Almost essentially all companies die. By the time you're my age, it's very likely there will not be a Microsoft or a Google. But there'll still be a London, and there'll still be a Moscow, and there'll still be a Baghdad. So cities persist, but companies die. They're like people, and that's good because that gives rise to the possibility of renewal. So the question is, how to put that into science. And as I say, you can do it. You can make network-based, and I'm not going to go into that. And part of that network base is that part of the fundamental question is, what, if anything, is being optimized by businesses, by finance, by economics, and so on. And in a city, for example, it may be that what is being optimized is every person wants to have more. Or that in terms of its physical aspects, every person wants to get from A to B, roughly speaking, as quickly as possible. So there are these kinds of ideas that you have to invoke and put into mathematics and solve the equations. And amazingly, the data agrees extraordinarily well with these kinds of things. So To answer the specific question that was the second part of the second question, which sciences? Well, it's obvious from what I said. One is evolutionary biology. Second is, from my viewpoint, physics, therefore by implication mathematics. We're asking the question, can we make a theoretical framework, a conceptual framework that is quantitative, predictive, and analytic? Thirdly, of course, social sciences, social networks, and therefore by implication also economics, and also by implication finance. And finally, of course, especially now to understand it, computer science, that is the use of big data, artificial intelligence, possibly machine learning, and so on. So, so in answer, I'm not really answering your question other than to say that I think one of the huge challenges in terms of dealing with the sustainability of the planet is to be able to put social organizations like businesses, companies, corporations, and cities into a quantitative predictive framework, and to recognize also that they're all interdependent upon one another. And we also need to have a completely holistic view of the whole thing in order to address the most challenging question of all, that is the sustainability of the entire system. So I'll finish there, and I've just given, scratched the surface, basically, of some of the ideas that I think need to go into this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you so much. And right away, let me please give the floor to Andrew Wagner. You're welcome, sir.
Thank you. The focus of my own research generally doesn't spend too much time on the internal workings of a business, but being trained as an economist, I look at the interaction between businesses. So I look at how companies compete and cooperate and how that kind of thing changes over time. So that's generally where I am at when I'm thinking about this question. And I'm going to start this with a personal story of my own experience. So when I began studying economics in graduate school, I had one professor who insisted that business and economics is just math, not psychology, nothing else, just math. You put in some numbers and you get some new numbers to come out. And to pass this professor's class, I was required to write an essay defending this mathematical philosophy. And I found that to be quite painful because I don't agree with it. And I'm not the only person in the field of economics who has this concern. I had another graduate professor who confided with me that when he was studying economics, he wrote a paper about how the profession uses too much math. And when he showed it to his professors, they told him to bury that paper and never speak about it to anyone because they thought that it would hurt his ability to get a job in the field. And I don't know how widespread this idea is, but it's a really powerful force that keeps the study of economics and business kind of stuck in a world of math that doesn't consider other subjects as much. And I don't think that's quite the correct approach, because business and economics relies on understanding how people behave, because they're made up of people making choices. So for that reason, you should at least include psychology. But I also believe that you can pull useful ideas from every field of study and combine them to look at business in different ways. And my own experience actually is in full agreement with the presentation that you just heard. And there are two very powerful subjects that help me understand business. The first one is history, and the second one is biology. So from a historical perspective, the evaluation of a business should compare it to other businesses in the past. And this is especially true when a company announces that they have an amazing new idea. They are almost certainly not the first ones to come up with this amazing new idea. So if you look at other businesses that had the same idea in the past, you can learn a lot about how it worked, why it did not work. So a historical perspective is really helpful from looking at business in that perspective. But I actually think the biological perspective is even more powerful, and more specifically, how business develops through an evolutionary process. So the way that different companies compete and cooperate with each other is directly comparable to the way that different species compete and cooperate to survive. And my favorite example of this is from the video game industry. So when you talk about evolution, the basic idea is that an organism that successfully creates a new generation will pass on the traits that made them successful, and the next generation will have some differences from the previous generation, but they'll be quite similar. And the features that work best for survival will continue while some new adaptations are added. The reason I like the video game industry as a comparison is because the video game market is described in terms of generation. So each new group of video game consoles that comes out, and a console is the hardware that people use to play the games, it's known as a new generation. And every new generation has something new, a new idea, some new games, something like that. But it also carries forward the designs and the ideas that were successful in the past generations. So I think it's a good comparison, and it's really helpful to see that connection with biology. And I think that this is also useful in every market. When a market develops, it carries forward ideas from past markets, adds some new things, some new adaptations. And the way I would end this is the view that is summarized quite often is adapt or die when you're talking about businesses. And I think this is an appropriate way to look at business. And I would emphasize that adaptation is not just competition, it's competition and cooperation. So my perspective is history and biology, not just math and psychology. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your report. Thank you for sharing your viewpoints. And this is the high time. We're giving the floor to our next speaker, Lucien Oulabib. Please, you're welcome. Turn on your mic, please.
Yes. It's a very good question. Maybe I would take this question in two sides. The outside the business and inside the business. Inside the business, for instance, I suppose, of course, a good technology and a good organization, but also a good leadership and a good spirit inside the enterprise, because it's necessary to activate all the process as a team. It's trivial, it's basic to say that, but it's necessary to cooperate indeed inside the enterprise between shareholders, owners, workers, and to be very cooperative. And I suppose when you are a good spirit, a good soul inside the enterprise, which understood very well the asking of the public and so on, you have a capacity to be to live longer. Indeed, when Geoffrey said the town is always alive, like Moscow, London, Paris, Baghdad, etc., but the enterprise died. You have also sometimes some enterprise who persist along the not the century for this time being, but for long decades, you have the same enterprise. And in France, for instance, we have very familiar enterprise, but very strong enterprise. In Germany, for instance, and I suppose also in US and in other country. But it's interesting to understood how this kind of enterprise have the capacity to have a dynamic and a very strong capacity to envelop to 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 make all the people together like a team. It's a first step, the first side, if you want. The second side, outside. I want to say in the public, the audience, the client, how all the people. As asking some object, tools, etc. In the, I suppose, a very principal concept is the interaction. Interaction between the market, the public, and the enterprise, and the capacity to the enterprise to react quickly with the demand of the public, but not so quickly, not so fast. For instance, I saw in the USA, for instance, or in Europe, some company react very too much about the fashion, about the political situation, to react very to insert inside the division of the audience of the ideological problem and to become like a party, a political party. For instance, you have Coca-Cola, for instance, take some strong affirmation, and it's too much. I suppose it's too much because all the public didn't share this kind of extremity because the public, when they prefer Coca-Cola and not Pepsi-Cola, it's like imaginary, it's very singularity, it's very precious to between, it's an interaction very intimate, very secret between the consumers and his product. And I am afraid to see that sometimes you have a lot of interference, bad interference. It's why in my conclusion I said I will say it's good now to interact and to have as goal to organize very well the enterprise, the technology, but i- indeed, effectively, we are in the city, we are in the context, the political context, but the enterprise, the company have to stay away about the conflicts and to have the capacity to preserve the dream, the imaginary between each consumer and his products which is preferred. And that's why it's necessary for the very leadership to be careful about the life of this market, because it's very fragile, like a life. The life is solid, but also it's fragile. Well, it's all I can say for now. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Oulahbib. And right away, I'm giving the floor to our next speaker, Svetlana Illiusha. You're welcome. Turn on your mic, please.
Спасибо, что дали слово.
Thank you for giving me the floor.
Я предлагаю посмотреть на бизнес не как на химическую формулу, а как на рабочую систему.
To begin with, I would like to analyze business phenomenon not as a chemical formula, but as the system.
И позвольте мне представить первую модель.
And let me please present you the very first model.
Ирина Игоревна, дайте, пожалуйста, знать, видна ли модель на экране.
Let's go.
Спасибо. Итак, бизнес как рабочая система состоит из 4 компонентов. Если одного из них не хватает, эта система не будет работать.
So to begin with, this heuristic model represents business as a system consisting of 4 elements. And the first issue concerns the fact that in case we lack at least one of the elements, then the business as the term or as a notion doesn't exist. The system is not going to operate.
Первый компонент – это коммуникационные системы. Я о них уже немного рассказала в первом вопросе, и без них, безусловно, бизнес не может взаимодействовать с другими участниками рынка.
The very first component concerns the communication systems, and previously, within the discussion of the first question, we have covered this component for a while, because again, without the communication system, there would be no business.
Yes. Второй компонент – это люди, и здесь имеется в виду как специалисты конкретной компании, такие партнеры этого бизнеса, такие внешние консультанты, все люди, от которых зависит работа этого бизнеса.
Secondly, as a component, we would like to highlight people. I mean, the component of people. By people, we mean everyone, like the board of the partners or the staff, the employees, everyone, because without people, the business system won't function.
Третья составляющая – это технологии, и, безусловно, технологии должны быть такими, чтобы они обеспечивали преимущества компании на рынке.
At the third component, we're going to figure out the component of technologies, and logical as it may seem, with the technologies should be of that very level that make the enterprise go advantageous in contrast to the other companies on the market.
И четвертое – это, конечно же, менеджмент. Без управления система ехать не может.
And the first component or element concerns management issue. Again, without management, this system or this machine, it won't work, it won't function.
Если мы представим бизнес вот как машину, и это 4 колеса этой машины, то нам нужен двигатель.
Again, let's pretend that this is not just a model. Let's analogically compare this to any sort of machinery, like to a car. Let's pretend we're driving a car. And these 4 components, they are just like the 4 wheels of the car. However, if we're dealing with a car, where is the engine?
И этот двигатель будет тоже состоять из 4 блоков.
And speaking about the engine itself, we should say that it consists of 4 blocks as well.
Позвольте представить вторую модель. Это счетно-решающая модель, созданная на базе теста Сонди. Создана она академиком Олегом Мальцевым.
And let me please represent the very second model. And this heuristic decision-making model was actually verified by academician Dr. Oleg Maltsev on the basis of the Lopatiuk psychology core.
Итак, какие у нас есть двигатели? Первый – это блок философии.
Светлана, покажите, пожалуйста, модель. Не переключилась.
Не видно, да?
So we're going to discuss the elements of this very model. Just a second, please. So let me kindly remind you, we have 4 components, and the very first component that we see right now. So this is skills, management, and conditions. So let's discuss the decision-making heuristic model.
Итак, первый блок двигателя – это философия.
So the very first block of this engine, let me kindly remind you, we are discussing the engine or motor, this is philosophy.
Здесь имеется в виду философия вашего бизнеса. Ради чего вы и ваши люди занимаются этим делом, кроме денег?
By philosophy component, we mean actually the complex answer to the question, what for and why are you making your business? I mean, what for and why you, together with your people, with your team, are dealing with that stuff? Why are you involved in that business? The answer is in the philosophical area.
Сегодня это часто называется миссией компании, но философия – это более широкое понятие.
Today, kind of frequently, we are seeing the term the mission of the company. However, we should say that the philosophy is not the same as the mission. Philosophy is much wider and hierarchically more complex than just a mission.
Следующий блок – это навыки. Навыки людей, которые работают в этом бизнесе, и они требуют постоянное повышения квалификации.
The next engine's block concerns the block of skills. And by skills, we mean that actually this is that very notion that we constantly have to acquire. And I mean both those who manage the company and those who work there, the employees, the staff.
Здесь важно сказать, что тот период, когда ценились дипломы, количество сертификатов, он уже прошел. Сегодня основателей, инвесторов интересуют фактически навыки людей, которые способны сделать ту или иную работу, сделать ее максимально качественно.
And as a matter of fact, we should mention that the tendency of certificates and diplomas is actually the tendency that went back to history. I mean, today, the investors and the business owners, they are not more interested in what kind of diploma you owe or where have you studied or what education you have, but they are much more interested in your skills. I mean, in your capacities and abilities. What can one do in order to do his job correctly, in the most accurate way, in the most successful way?
Следующий блок – это условия, и он же это коммуникационные системы.
So the very next block of the engine we're going to discuss mentions conditions. And here, by conditions, we mean the environmental conditions or the communication system.
Сюда относится способность компании создавать условия для себя, для ведения бизнеса и получения прибыли, и способность справляться со внешними условиями, которые компания не могла, например, прогнозировать, тот же кризис или пандемия.
By conditions management or conditions environmental block, we mean that, first of all, on the one hand, from the internal side, we should know how to create these special conditions or terms in order to make our business, our company function in the most successful way. On the other hand, if we're looking externally, we should know how to manage the external conditions and changes. Especially, we have to learn how to take the correct prognosis of these changes. Likewise, what should we do in case there may come any type of crisis or maybe like the concurrent actions, like current events like the pandemic?
Ну и, безусловно, четвертый блок – это менеджмент, потому что если нет организации, если система не отлажена и не работает как часы, будут постоянные сбои.
And then, of course, the block and the engine block number 4 that should be mentioned according to this model concerns management. And again, no doubt, management is that very sophisticated substance, that very thing that actually should be paid so much attention to. Otherwise, if we are lacking management, we are facing certain management barriers, we are going to face some sort of losses, decades, and problems.
На модели мы видим несколько стрелок. Они обозначают механизмы взаимодействия этих блоков между собой.
As far as the decision-making heuristic model is concerned, here between the blocks, you may see certain arrows. These arrows represent the cooperation and correlation ways of these blocks correlating with one another. I mean, how these blocks are actually working as the model and correlating as the parts of this model.
И благодаря этой модели мы можем анализировать состояние как отдельной компании, так и рынка в целом.
And on the basis of this heuristic model, one is getting capable to analyze not only the way this or that enterprise functions, but also to analyze and to take the prognostics of the market as a whole system, at the whole environment.
Согласно концепции Сонди, все эти блоки в итоге формируются в определенное положение вещей.
According to the concept of Lipot-Zondi, and let me tell you just in brief that this is one of the most prominent psychologists, all these four components, all these four elements, having correlated with or intersected with one another, form a specific state of affairs or a situation.
И это положение вещей характеризуется двумя параметрами.
And this environmental situation or state is characterized with two parameters.
Условно мы их называем «быть» и «иметь».
And these parameters, again, this is like the metaphoric analogy, just to make it sound simpler. These two parameters are like to be and to have.
Что мы имеем в виду «быть»? Это положение компании на рынке, это ее степень влияния, это масштаб ее деятельности, это доля рынка.
So again, by to be, I mean, what is to be for the company? What is the company on the market? What does it have? I mean, it's holds stocks, its market percentage, all its advantages, and everything that's of that concern.
И когда мы говорим о факторе «иметь», это капитализация компании, это ее финансовое благосостояние в широком смысле.
Speaking about to have, by having from the merits of company, we mean its capitalistic coefficient or its financial background. What does it have in fact?
И если вас не устраивает состояние вашей компании или положение ее на рынке, то проблемы и ответы на эти проблемы нужно искать в этих двух моделях, в блоках этих моделей.
And just in case one is not, let me say, contented with the company status, he is analyzing, he is working, he is guiding, etc. One can use and should use, it's like a recommendation, these two models in order to take a look and to analyze what is actually going on, what's right, what's wrong, what's correct, etc.
Если мы говорим о науках, которые требуются в бизнесе,
Speaking about the sciences or branches of sciences that correlate to business phenomenon,
я всегда вспоминаю фразу своего научного руководителя Олега Мальцева.
I'm always, let me say, recalling the saying of my scientific manager, scientific mentor, Oleg Maltsev,
Что бизнес – это война, поэтому любому бизнесмену необходимо изучать историю войны, воинское искусство, тактику и стратегию.
and since business is the warfare, it's like a war, it could be compared to war, then one definitely should learn all the sciences connected with tactics, with the weapon handling, with warfare strategies, etc.
Безусловно, нужно изучать историю и прототипы,
No doubt, one also should learn the history itself as well as the historical prototypes.
и поскольку в результате исследований мы поняли, что истоки бизнеса лежат в центре Европы, в Рейне, то нам нужно искать науку, которая была там. Эта наука называлась европейским мистицизмом.
And since throughout, let me say, generations and decades of the scientific research, we have come to the conclusion in the Expeditionary Corps that actually the origins and the roots of this business science, they are in Europe, in Germany, I mean, in the area called Rhine area. We should learn the science that some, let me say, decades before were called as European mysticism. That's the science one should learn.
Нужно пояснить, что здесь, в общем-то, никакой мистики и волшебства нет. Эта наука называется мистицизмом в силу того, что большинство знаний потеряны. И сегодня люди то, что не понимают, они не мистифицируют это.
Again, speaking about the mysticism notion, it's not like the notion of something sounding like a fairy tale. By mysticism, we mean that very component that was lost in the historical legacy. I mean, today we have lost so many data, and having lost these data, in fact, if we don't realize what's going on, we have the psychological tendency to mystify this very lack of realization. That's why this is the mystification. This is just the thing that we don't know today. However, previously, all the data was known and well aware.
В контексте философии Бодрияра и общества потребления, в котором мы сегодня живем,
In the context of Baudrillard's philosophy and his consumer society that we are the part of these days,
я бы хотела обратить внимание на психологию, которая сегодня поставлена на службу бизнеса, и перед ней поставлена одна главная задача.
I would like to drive your attention to the psychology, to the scientific area of psychology, since psychology is serving business scopes, business objectives, and its primary objective is as follows.
Как заставить людей как можно больше производить и потреблять товаров?
Actually, this objective concerns of the ways of making the person both produce and to consume. The more the goods, the better.
Из-за этого мы видим, что образовался большой пробел в знаниях и исследованиях в области диагностики и терапии психологических проблем современного человека.
Moreover, this area of knowledge also concerns that one may use these things in order to produce the diagnostics to see the real problems of the person or the person who is dealing with the area.
И я думаю, что это актуальная проблематика, и, возможно, она заслуживает отдельной научной конференции. Спасибо за внимание.
Moreover, I believe that the problematics we are speaking right now actually deserves the, let me say, separate conference or separate discussion, since it's complex and interdisciplinary again. And by this, let me please thank you so much for your kind attention. So thank you, Svetlana.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for all your participation. Special thanks to Geoffrey Brian West. Thank you for your dynamic speech, for your scientific impact. Thank you, Andrew Wagner. Thank you, Lucian Ulab. Again, thank you so much for taking part in this conference. And this is high time. We have fortunately finished the fourth day of our international conference, Real Life and Real Economics online discussion. Soon after, some data and some materials like the brochure will be published later on our European Academy website, and everyone who is eager to see these materials and get acquainted with the results of the conference will have that very opportunity. So by this very moment, I'm your moderator, your humble moderator, is ready to say thank you, goodbye, be safe, and see you soon. See you tomorrow.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Bye.
Thank you so
Bye.
much.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Thank you very much. Bye.